framework and tell you a little bit about the Multi-Donor Fund for Aceh and Nias and the JRF for those of you who aren't familiar, and a little bit about what kind of work these two programs did. And then I'll turn it over quickly to Marianne so she can get more into the specifics of our gender working paper. The Multi-Donor Fund for Aceh and Nias was in response, as Marcus said, to the 2004 Asian tsunami and a subsequent earthquake that hit the region of Nias. It pooled funds from 15 donors, including the World Bank as a donor, and to the value of $655 million. It was a government-led partnership, and this was really key to both the direction and the success of the program. Some of the main the partner agencies that were involved in the fund, it was not just the World Bank, but also worked with UNDP, ILO, WFP, and so they also were responsible for oversight and gender policies on some of the projects. The funds amounted to about 10% of the overall reconstruction of Aceh, but beyond that it had a much bigger impact because it was actually supporting the government, and so the funds were leveraged significantly in terms of the overall impact. The government had asked the MDF to use a gap-filling approach, so it wasn't meant to be a program that touched on every sector, but really filling in the gaps between what the government itself was doing and what NGOs were doing in the area and other bilateral donors. And it worked on 6 focus areas, which I'll come to in a minute. It was established in May of 2005 and closed just this past December, and we're wrapping up our knowledge management and other issues now. The JRF was in response to an earthquake in Yogyakarta and Central Java in May 2006. Using the model of the MDF. The MDF was so successful and perceived to be a good model for post-disaster financing, and so the government requested to use the same model and for the bank to be trustee of another trust fund. This one had 7 donors with $94 million. It was extended again, it was used to cover another disaster that occurred a few months later on the south coast of West Java, a smaller tsunami. And then again in 2010, when it was just about to close, the Mount Merapi volcanic eruptions occurred, and it was used to respond to that. So these programs have now covered a range of disasters. This one was led by national government with heavy provincial government coordination as well. Main implementers were the government, Department of Public Works, the GIZ, and the IOM. And focus in this program was mostly on housing, livelihoods, and disaster risk reduction. Established 2006 and closed also together with the MDF in 2012. So here's just a map to show where the areas were that we worked. Left side Sumatra's Aceh and Java in the middle. The MDF's outcome areas, and these are some of the areas Marianne looked at for the gender working paper. MDF worked on recovery of communities, particularly housing, community infrastructure, and land titling. The JRF also worked heavily on recovery of communities, large infrastructure and transport, and this included logistics support as well as recovery of large infrastructure, included significant capacity building component. Governance and capacity building also focused very much on building local government capacity. Enhancing the recovery process was really support to the government while they were implementing the reconstruction, and this included the work on disaster risk reduction. And then sustaining the environment, which was somewhat unique among post-disaster funds to have a focus specifically on protecting and sustaining the environment during reconstruction. And then finally, economic development and livelihoods, which was implemented more in the third phase of MDF and later phase of JRF's work as well. So there were 23 projects under the MDF in total, 5 projects and 2 outcome areas in the JRF. Now, as Marcus said, in the last year, we've had the luxury of being able to complete the feedback loop and really put a lot of effort in the last year on the lessons learned from the Reconstruction, and particularly from the two trust funds. So we focused on these 5 areas and have produced working papers on each of these areas. And then we have this set of knowledge notes which we put on your chair. And so there's one knowledge note for each of the working papers as well, which is sort of a summary encapsulating. So we had one on community-based reconstruction, which includes our housing program. Another one on capacity building across the MDF and JRF. Sorry, that one didn't have JRF. Infrastructure also, mostly focused on large infrastructure. And then the gender paper, which Marianne will talk about. And then we have another paper on multi-donor funds as an instrument for recovery. We also conducted an international conference in November where we had people coming in from other countries with post-disaster experience, Haiti, Pakistan, and participation to discuss the lessons learned, heavy government participation as well on the lessons learned from the MDF. And we also have a book here on the Recompact housing program, and that also had a significant gender component, and I don't think George is here yet, but that will be one of the things that Marianne talks about quite a bit and is covered quite a bit in the working paper. Okay, with that, that's the background, and then we'll let Marianne give you some of the details of how gender mainstreaming and the voice and role of women played out in these.
Okay, I think it's often presented as a truism that disasters are an opportunity to do things differently. And certainly in countries where men and women have strong and equal rights, not only are things built back better, the death rates between men and women tend to be similar, and their access to benefits and supports tend to be similar. And you do see quite substantial change in going forward. That's not the case where women's rights are significantly hindered or significantly less than men's, and there is structural discrimination. And this was certainly the case in Aceh, where I think we have to remember there was 30 years of conflict, very violent, very engendered conflict, with women suffering both in terms of gender violence but also in very high levels of widowhood, mortality and abuse. The women-headed households in Aceh prior to the tsunami was around 23%. The average in Indonesia around at that time is more towards the 11.4%, something around then. So you can see women in Aceh were already deeply discriminated against, already suffering a great deal of trauma, and already because of the conflict, mobility was constrained prior to the disaster. Very different gender contexts in Java and Jogja. And when we come back to discussions, I do think it's important to remember the issue about differential rights between men and women and the gender context prior to any disaster that strikes. Right. Back again. So the strengthening of legal rights then, if you see it in that context, was supremely important to moving beyond just making sure women got equal access to benefits, but attempting to address some of the structural lack of rights and denial of rights that women were suffering. So when we talk about almost 30% of land certificates issued for women, either jointly or singly, we are talking from coming in a position of nil land titling. So 30% may not seem much, but actually it's a major step forward under that context. They also started to develop a community-driven approach to adjudication of land rights in partnership with NGOs, which set a benchmark in Indonesia about how you could address spatial planning, land rights, and to some extent how you would do DDR prior to future disasters. So let's look at some other impacts. As Anita said earlier, MDF was picking up the gaps. It wasn't addressing those areas which are generally seen as soft and the ones which get more attention to gender, like education, like health. It was addressing infrastructure and economic empowerment. It was also addressing the attempt to increase women's voice and agency within building back through community planning and community implementation. What's striking about these areas, these are the areas globally in normal times, not disaster times, not in times of fragility, not in times of conflict, when gender equality is most challenging to produce, to gain progress in. So imagine when you're dealing with one of the worst disasters that that region had seen, and you're attempting to progress gender equality when it's already significantly challenging for Indonesia to meet it around voice and agency and economic empowerment. That's an important context because there were a number of difficulties which nobody, government, the trust funds or NGOs were able to address around gender mainstreaming, and they weren't alone, and I think we need to remember that. Housing and infrastructure accounts for 70% of losses generally. Women on the whole were not active participants in rebuilding back the houses, and it's in that context that Reconstruction has to be acknowledged as one of the major success stories of building back the tsunami and Java, because they set a target participation rate of 30%, which is a standard target headcount for women's involvement. In Aceh, they were hitting 40%, and in some areas they were hitting 50%. The same in Java. The quality of participation is going to change from area to area, village to village, but that's true across the board, not just for Reconstruction. To get that head count is significantly important, because if you get housing, if you get resettlement right, if you get women involved, you are starting to open up those political spaces where women can start to activate their agency and raise their voices. If you start through education and health, they're very important. As we saw in Aceh, the gains you make around gender equality mainstreaming do not cross over. They do not allow women to move into infrastructure or to start opening up non-traditional spaces for economic empowerment post-Reconstruction. There is a possibility in housing, and there is a possibility in community settlement, because it's so much connected for cash to work, but also it's so much connected to major decision making within local communities, where other decisions start to be made, and once you get women's presence, you start opening up space for voice. What else did you do around housing and infrastructure? You changed the nature of the houses. It shouldn't be that strange. Who lives in houses? Who does most of the work in houses? Who does most of the home-based work from houses? Oops, women and children. So when you ask them how they would like to design their house, obviously they design it very differently. Women said to me things like, we never had a toilet before. We could have a toilet inside. We used to have to cook outside because that's where we were told to. But now we've got a kitchen inside. That's a major improvement on a number of counts. One, it is hugely empowering to have control over your own space. Doesn't matter who you are, how poor you are, how rich you are, it is hugely empowering to know that you can control your own space. Secondly, as many of the women described as I went to talk to them, it's healing, because the home is part of your identity, particularly for women in Java who work predominantly, 40% of women in Java work in home-based industries. For them, they felt stronger, is how they described it. The houses were stronger, we were stronger. It was part of us taking back our lives and healing from the trauma. And that's an important thing which we don't recognise in housing, and why it's important in terms of promoting gender equality and promoting women's self-esteem to take part in public decision making. Moving on. What else does it do? I think, as Margaret will tell you and other people in the room, women globally are prepared to invest far more than men in disaster preparedness. We know that the evidence is extremely strong. This was true in Aceh, it was true in Java, it was true in Jogja. Women were clamouring to be part of it, and they valued the knowledge and skills they got for building houses. There is one beautiful quote of a group of women I went to talk to in Yogyakarta, and one of the women said, and all the rest were nodding, was, "Imagine us, we're just housewives, and we built our own houses. Imagine it, we know how to build our own houses. We can do anything now." And I think that's true in any disaster context. It's empowering. It's empowering to know that you can develop those skills and they will stay with you. However, there was major missed opportunities to enhance this demand by women to take part in DDR and to build their skills to be able to be leaders in post-disaster reconstruction should another disaster hit. The 30% headcount sent for reconstruction programs was lowered for DDR. It was around 25%. There was much less effort to involve women from all sections of the community, so it tended to be dominated by the better off. I'll come back to the issue of information flows and who controls information later. One programme that was run by the MDF in Aceh was far more successful because they invested time in reaching women, and went from house to house to bring them into the process of community planning for disaster. And they recognised it takes longer. It takes longer, but it's far more efficient and effective to get the whole community on board and to invest money prior to the disaster than it is afterwards, which was what was recognised by the Aceh DDR group. What else good practice impacts did we see from the MDF and JDR? The first thing to mention is there was very mixed results across the board in terms of economic regeneration. It clearly benefited men. This is true in most reconstruction, post-disaster reconstruction. It wasn't very different in any of these areas, but you did see signs of good practice, particularly in Java and Jogja. The challenge for future disasters is to institutionalise that and mainstream it in other post-reconstruction disaster. But we saw two things I'd like to highlight, really. Firstly is women were involved in non-traditional areas through the MDF and the JRF in housing reconstruction and roads reconstruction. And in both housing and roads, these projects set a benchmark for showing that women could not only maintain the same quality of construction as men, but they could take leadership roles and supervisory roles in maintaining quality and roles in decision making. So much so that both methods, approaches, are being mainstreamed throughout Indonesia. That's the road projects and the Reconpack, and recognised as one of the strengths, not just recognised by a government, but in all cases, men and women, both men and women, in surveys showed much higher degree of satisfaction with the quality and also with what was produced, so where the roads were planned, where the houses were put, etc. In Java, for example, there was 97% positive satisfaction with the housing reconstruction. The other thing that, particularly in Java, that the JRF supported projects were able to do is they actually boosted women's income to beyond pre-disaster levels. And we have here very beautiful organic vegetable dye batik made by women who prior to the disaster were piece workers working for middlemen. They are now a globally recognised batik artisans running their own business cooperative and looking forward to a very bright future. And selling these at vast amounts of money in ways that they weren't able to do before. The other thing is change of status. These women changed their status from piece workers with really no status whatsoever, just working from their home, to organic vegetable dye artisanal batik makers. You can go anywhere in the world with your card and put that on and feel very proud of yourself. In Aceh, you had women who joined cash for work as scavengers in the early stages of recovery, and by the end of it were waste management entrepreneurs with uniforms and cards, and had a status in their communities and wider. Scavengers never have status. They are the lowest of the low. When I did poverty analysis, they were the hated poor. So to go through a period of 7 years to that kind of status recognition is very valuable, because they have the sense of self, the agency to take part in a whole range of public communication, public decision making, because of that change in status. And we should never forget how important that is, to be able to exercise your agency. Right. The most important thing that I don't think we learned, but it was reinforcing, was that if you invest time and resources in the soft skills for women, and for men for that matter, so knowledge networks, marketing, business, then not only do you increase their future shock, but you increase their resilience against future shock and their economic security. And that quote says it all, really. If you give us money or you give us credit, we'll spend it on life, and then it's gone and we have nothing left. But you give us knowledge, you give us training, you give us equipment, that's much better. These are assets that will always stay with us. And that's what really happened in JRF, that the supported programs really focused on that. You saw some of the projects in Aceh doing that. They had much better, much more sustainable results, not just higher incomes, but women feeling that they could take part, a kind of multiplier ripple effect, that they could take part in other activities, they could also take part in wider decision making. Where you did invest time in mobilisation, in community facilitation, you saw increased social cohesion and strengthened local institutions. The IOM project in Java, for example, did one of the few that did a baseline and post an exit survey of changes in women's status and changes of women's involvement in local decision making. And they showed that the base was around a 9% women involvement. By the end of their involvement, which was only 3 years, it had gone up to 21%, which is significant, I think, in the areas they were working. Again, this is not new. We've known it for a long time, not just post-Reconstruction. You involve women in decision-making around local community goods and assets. They choose different ones. They choose public assets, water, sanitation and health clinics. You also undoubtedly got increased trust and satisfaction in recovery processes when women and women were both involved. And this was across the board, well over 60-70%, much higher than the percentage shown on government-only run reconstruction projects. It's not easy. Promoting women's participation is not easy. If it was easy, then we'd have all been out of a job a long time ago and communities would be organising themselves. it's particularly not easy post-disaster or in conflict times. Access to information is a major problem for women. It's a real major problem for women during conflict, in fragile states, post-disaster, because of threats of violence, threats of harassment, and just the sheer physical difficulty of moving around. When we did the social sustainability review, this was the biggest complaint of women, that they couldn't get access to information, either because they didn't live near enough to the head of the village or the notice board, or because they were poor or an ethnic minority or disabled, so they were just overlooked. Some of the projects showed really innovative ways of getting information to women. My favourite is barefoot texting, which was mobile ice cream sellers being called to the house of the head of the village, given messages, and as they went round Javanese villages hearing ice cream, they'd also go, "We're having a meeting tonight about DDR," and other things. But they'd also take messages back, because there's one thing that, we all like ice creams, but they particularly like ice creams in Javanese villages. Fantastic way, and the JRF projects piggybacked on that to get their messages through. Very simple, very clever. In NIAS, where women generally didn't go to meetings, gender disparities in NIAS are very deep, very structural. Women have very little say in public decision making. The local projects went to church. They went to church and they stood outside and they whispered messages to women. They also became choristers and sang with them in order to get the message across. It was only one evening a week, but it made a huge difference to the amount of women who participated. When I talked to the project managers that were organising these kind of very innovative ways, I said, "Why didn't you put it in the operational manuals?" Yeah. "I don't know." And then she said, and I think this is something we might like to talk about later, is we're often not very good at learning when we do good practice and then operationalising it. We just did it and it worked and then we carried on. And I think we need to find ways to make sure that these innovations, simple, cheap, cost-effective innovations, get spread and are operationalised in manuals. They'll be different, and they'll be different depending on who the women are. MDF and JRF were no different really in reaching the poorest women and empowering them to take part in decision making. They were no worse. I think other NGOs and government had equal challenges in reaching the poorest. And there are major trade-offs between operating at scale and trying to reach as many people as possible and ensuring the inclusion of the poorest and most marginalised. CDD programmes have always had this problem and have always had difficulties in reaching the poorest. What can you do? Two things certainly came out of this, which need to be thought about more, I think. One is institutionalise women-only meetings post-Reconstruction. They are not either. They are an additional and a valued part of opening up space for all women to start developing the skills, capacities, confidence to take part in wider community meetings. And that's the way they should be seen. When projects had women-only meetings, women had a significant role in representing themselves in bigger meetings, not just within communities, but at local governance level, and for some women beyond. It is an essential part to build agency. It also opens up a little space to bring in poorer women, not on its own, but it's there. Much easier for them to join a women's only meeting than it is to go straight to a larger mixed meeting. The second one is to make smart investments in partnerships with NGOs, other organisations who work directly with poorer women, with marginalised women. Use budgets flexibly to do this. One of the most exciting, I think, and successful smart partnerships was done by KDP, which is a CDD program in Indonesia, with PECA, which is a women's rights for widows and marginalised women, where they were given special funds to not just work around housing and reconstruction, but also to work on issues of empowerment, women's rights, raising confidence, building agency, so the widows and marginalised women could start to have a more mainstream role and place within local life and beyond. It worked significantly. It wasn't institutionalised and it wasn't mainstream, but it showed what could be done if you made small but smart investments and recognised comparative strengths and comparative weaknesses between different projects. So, what's the key lesson? When women are active participants, there are better quality outcomes for everyone. It's a shame we have to say that, really, because we've known it a very long time. I'm not joking here. I went back and looked at the literature. That statement was made in 1995, and I looked at lessons learnt from the Hurricane Mitch of 1998, World Bank Lessons Learnt Programme. Very good paper by Delaney and Shader, I think. I could have cut and pasted and earned a lot of money by doing nothing. I didn't, because I'm not that kind of person. Because we're not, as you say, it's not that we don't learn the lessons. Our challenge is how do we institutionalise those lessons at different levels and with different people and in different ways. And I hope that's what we can discuss together. Gender equality and women's empowerment is active facilitation, and one of the key findings for JRF, which wasn't about gender equality, was just about community participation, is the best investment you can make is in capacity building local facilitators. The payoffs are enormous. We need to institutionalise that in all organisations and in government. That's difficult to do. It also needs additional investment and support at different levels, which I'll come on to. Make gender equality a fully integrated objective of reconstruction strategies. You may think this is already done. It certainly wasn't done in any of the 3 disasters we're looking at here. It wasn't a fully integrated objective of the master plans. It wasn't a fully integrated objective of most of the projects. It wasn't a fully integrated objective of the MDF or JRF, even though it's in policy. Why do you need it? Because if you don't have a fully integrated objective, you don't get a budget. And gender equality is all about sex, money and power. Get it in, then you can make some changes. Integrate gender analysis and gender disaggregated data into post-disaster needs and loss assessment. I think my colleagues around the table who are working on this could say far more than I did. Gender analysis is not there right at the beginning. And if you don't have it there, you're not opening up the political space, you're not opening up the governance space in which you can start to make programs, which you can start to demand money. Strengthen operational gender expertise. This is a major issue at all levels, actually. Somewhere, round about 1996, we all swiftly, as women, and some men, moved into gender advocacy, and we forgot about operations. What you saw in Aceh and in Java was very strong gender advocates pushing for policy change and very, very weak operational gender expertise being able to put it into practice, particularly around infrastructure, housing, and economic empowerment. So those very good intentions in government and in the trust funds, which are there to see in policy, could not be translated. And we need it. We need gender experts who know how to fix a budget, who know how to work through bureaucracies, who know what works practically, who knows how to doctor operational manuals. And we need them quick. We need a global pool, not just country by country, that can move in swiftly and support countries put into action. There was no question that the Indonesian government, through their policy, was committed to gender mainstreaming. They didn't know how, and that came back again and again. People didn't know how, wanted to know how. I spoke earlier about introduce more flexible funding for innovative gender work. How you do that will differ from country to country. In Indonesia, it was through doing programs off the main government budget. But in other countries, there will be different ways of doing it. It's just recognising that in order to reach different groups of women and all, to do things in an innovative way. For example, George can talk of the kind of stuff that ReckonPack and UPP did in terms of raising gender awareness and supporting facilitators think more carefully about gender equality goals. You have to think differently. These ones, I think, also are the kind of things which are already being talked about globally in different forums. Sector-wide and theme-based gender analysis as early as possible, institutionalised gender in operational procedures. You would imagine they would be. They're not. They weren't in the operational manuals of the MDF and JRF. They weren't in the operational manuals of most of the projects that they supported, because you kind of forget. They're there in the policy. You forget to put them in the operational manuals. But people barely move if the operational manual doesn't tell them to. So if you don't talk about gender in it, it won't be addressed. Mainstream gender equality objectives in procurement and contracting. Because one of the constraints that the MDF and JRF had is they had no ways of making their programmes accountable to the statements they made in their programmes. The only way you can normally do it is in procurement and contracting. You can demand percentages in contracting. Lots of people say, of course, you can't do this, it makes it too long. We have no problem around finance, and we have no problem around environment. When we are talking about 50% of the population, I feel we shouldn't have any problem there either. ILO have shown that you can set gender equality objectives in both procurement and contracting when you're working at local level reconstruction, so why not higher? Include qualitative and quantitative gender-sensitive indicators. You would imagine they were already there. They weren't at any level. Most of them were output indicators. And my final point, I think, is gender equality is far more than the number of women's heads you get sitting in a meeting. Far, far more. And we need indicators which show us both the quality and the quantity of women's involvement and women's using their voice and agency to shape reconstruction processes in the same way as men. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita and Marianne. Most certainly a treasure trove of experience and lessons, and yes, you do remind us of the challenges that still lie ahead. I would now like to give Margaret and then Raja the opportunity to respond directly to some of the issues that may have come out of the presentation, or draw on the global experience otherwise to bring home the points that we need to operationalize what we've learned.
Sure.
Please.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks both of you for the great presentation. I wanted to pick up on sort of two key points that that Marianne raised. The first one is just the importance of this as an important opportunity, and it really is the Reconstruction effort providing a key entry point that can have humongous beneficial developmental ripple effects for gender equality and for development in general. I mean, all of this is very much, in line with the WDR of, this isn't just the right thing to do, it's good economics, it's good development, women's empowerment. And this just provides a special context where I think, again, you raise the point that we always talk about this window of opportunity and to do things differently. Most of those opportunities are squandered, but I think that gender is one where there have been key gains made, and that if managed better, we can utilize it more. And also not just in the Reconstruction period, but in the sort of ex-ante preventative mode as well. And for me personally, with a bigger focus now on climate change adaptation, we're sort of collecting more and more evidence now around the fact that women have more effective strategies to adapt than men would. So that look at sort of softer, more efficient use of natural resources, of sort of using what they have more effectively and efficiently, than opposed to what coping strategies developed by men would have that would lead more towards a path of maladaptation. So, and I personally view climate change as the biggest man-made impending disaster we're ever facing, and in that context we really need to promote women as sort of champions of resilience building, and and we need to learn from this and able to do that in the wider context. And there's lots and lots of examples. Two very quick ones: after the Marmara earthquake in Turkey, just giving women a safe space to organize in a tent so that they could share childcare, so that they were then able to participate in negotiations with their local and national authorities about what their communities were getting in terms of recovery and reconstruction support. That was key. That blossomed, almost 15 years later. They are still running it became a small business development organization for women. So it had huge development ripple effects for the communities that these women lived in. Another one, and you mentioned Honduras after Mitch, there was a Garifuna community that just they were very remote. They didn't get any assistance after the hurricane. The women organized just to get relief to people that they knew that needed it. They are now a community development organization that has built long-term resilience through reforestation, through soil conservation, through doing lots of other activities. So there's just sort of countless examples where these opportunities were seized because of basic survival, and then but resulted in really long-term positive social transformation. And we really need to sort of do more of that. And that leads me to the second point, which is then how do we learn these lessons? Because as you said, there's opportunities that were missed, and none of this is sort of what we automatically do, and it needs to become that. When we were having a conversation about what people were going to say today, I was reminded of when I brought up an initiative that I was involved with several years ago. It was around the time when the IEG did this big study of the bank's reconstruction efforts. I was heading a network, a DRR network at the time called Prevention. And we worked with them and IDB and the European Development Bank. We gathered about 60 or 70 evaluators and practitioners to look at why we were not learning lessons in disasters, disaster after disaster, repeating the same thing. We did some analysis and we came up with, I went back to look at my notes, there were 51 lessons related to disaster risk management that kept coming up again and again and again. And I couldn't find the whole list of the 51, so I can't sort of rattle them off to you, but we were looking at, just as evaluators, then, we had to we identified a few gaps, and some of those I remember included doing more multi-agency evaluation efforts, so that we're looking more at overall processes and impacts. So we did some studies around just the overall impact of the recovery process on communities, because agencies tend to do their individual project evaluations, but we don't look at the whole process of how these things interact and how they can oftentimes put people in a worse situation than they were before the disaster. So doing more sort of multi-agency efforts, we came up with the need to do more longitudinal studies, looking at recovery processes going back 10 years, 15 years time, doing more community level evaluations to get that perspective and capturing more baseline scenarios. There were a series of recommendations, and and sort of admitting that we were maybe we were great evaluators but not great communicators, and how we as institutions, evaluators and institutions, learn lessons. And it was about sort of linking work like this more closely to core staff trainings to get the operational impact. So we were trying to come up with ways to sort of get them operationalized, and looking at the sort of lesson learning and evaluation process as a way also, to bring it back to my first point, of bridging the gap between different communities, between the humanitarian action community, the development community, DRR community, and the climate change adaptation community, because we're all sort of focused on the same issues of protecting people, assets, and livelihoods through the management of risk. And we may speak sort of different dialects, but we have sort of the same goal, and we need to be learning these lessons. And I could guess that a climate change person is not going to be reading this stuff, but they need to know this stuff. So we really need to sort of bridge these gaps, and I'd be interested in maybe when we open it up to talk more about, where does this go from here, these lessons and things, and how we can do, really get the learning implemented, and it's a point that Marcus also raised. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd be curious about perhaps a GFDRR good practice note on lessons not learned. What every member of a post-disaster needs assessment needs to know about gender, but was too afraid to ask. With this, Raja.
Wow, that's a tall order. I'm stumped already. But first of all, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. And coming from the field where I've been involved in reconstruction efforts, and a very similar reconstruction effort in Pakistan, and very soon after the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia and Aceh, I think I can really align myself and subscribe to all the findings and the recommendations that you have made over here. But I will also say that I would like to maybe start off by giving some similarities between what happened in the Pakistan experience, and really would like to reinforce some of the recommendations and findings that you've made over here. And maybe give that perspective as well, and say that why did it work in Pakistan, and why it doesn't work in other places? Why don't we learn from history? I think one of the key reasons was that the earthquake in Pakistan happened maybe just 8 or 9 months after the 2004 tsunami. And that way, a number of lessons that were being learned in Aceh were, they sort of benefited the Pakistan experience, and Pakistan was very quick in adopting those lessons and moving forward on them. And the two key lessons, well, one of the key lessons that the Pakistan experience adopted was to really focus on these two priority sectors, which were housing and livelihood support or cash transfers, because that was the demand from the people. I mean, we all know, even in the assessments, that these two sectors are the priority sectors. But the government made a very conscious effort to focus on these two sectors on a priority basis. And I think that really set the tone for the remaining reconstruction effort, and it proved to be a fairly successful effort. But coming back to the topic, I think these two sectors really provided, as has been highlighted over here also, because they deal with private goods, these two sectors really provided the opportunity for women, if given the right environment, enabling environment, and support and facilitation, as you pointed out, to really bring about a huge change, to be really that delta or that change that is so important for the sustainability and resilience. And that itself is one of the key factors. And I'll come to the macro issue that I would like to raise and maybe hear more about it from everyone else, is how can that be put into place as quickly as possible? That kind of an enabling environment. As quickly as possible following the disaster? Or maybe I'll pose this question to everyone, even preceding disasters. And that's where the institutionalizing aspect comes in that you were talking about. And I think that merits a lot of discussion and focus. But just coming to the housing sector and the cash transfer sector. In the housing sector, the experience in Pakistan, very similar to what you have in Aceh and other experiences, was that the whole issue of access to information and looking at women's legal rights as well as overall building capacity of women in both technical as well as fund managers was extremely important. And that really brought about this whole shift from going in for a contractor-driven model or whether it should be a homeowner-driven model. And the decision to go ahead with a homeowner-driven model was such which had the women play a very important role. And in Pakistan, all land titling generally is in the name of the male bread earner or male member. But it actually provided an opportunity for the rules to be revisited, the laws to be revisited, and there were provisions made under emergency situations to change those laws. And women were given right to hold land title. That itself was a huge, significant change. And it's not that it happened only for that 4 or 5 years period for the Reconstruction. That is now continuing. So it's also important to understand that whatever, as you have pointed out, whatever opportunities or these kind of policies are brought about, they then also help inform future development and future agenda as well. On managing funds, I think that's also another area where I would like to really give some kind of an example from Pakistan, which has now become one of the key requirements of the national safety net program that Pakistan is implementing. What happened after the disaster was that there was a cash transfer program, and this livelihood cash transfer program was being implemented by providing each eligible homeowner with debit cards, which again, from a technological perspective also, of course, they actually used Visa debit cards and issued those Visa debit cards to the homeowners, which required the homeowner, and in this case it was, I'm not sure what the percentage, but every effort was made to have women hold those, women be the owners of those debit cards. And that required the women to have an identity. So they really had to go and issue identity cards to those women. And that also, in a way, goes a long way in women being empowered because they had an identity card. And what was seen was that where men were using these Visa debit cards at point of sale machines and where women were using these debit cards at point of sale machines, there was a huge difference. Because the place where the women were using them were much more organized, they were forming queues, they were a lot more disciplined, and the funds that they were getting, the money that they were getting, that money was actually finding its way back to the home. Whereas the men who were getting these cash transfers, in the studies that followed, what was discovered was that some of the money didn't find its way back to the home. So I think there are numerous examples where this kind of empowerment has really brought about a lot of sustainability and resilience, both in the housing sector as well as in the livelihood support sector. One other area that I would like to talk about is the role of women in community monitoring. Wherever there is contractor-driven model that is being used for, say, physical infrastructure or even social infrastructure, because the point that you made earlier, if there are large hospitals or health centers or schools or colleges that are being constructed through the contractor-driven model, where community monitoring was institutionalized and women were made part of the community monitoring, it made a huge difference. And this is documented. I think that's also another area which really speaks a lot in terms of how women's role can really make a big difference. Now let me step back to the point, to the macro level, which I really wanted to maybe raise as a question over here. Margaret talked about all these lessons. Marcus also mentioned what we don't learn from history. But even if we have these lessons documented, they are not available when a disaster happens. And these things across the board. I think this is where it's important that some kind of institutionalization of this whole documentation needs to be done. I'll tell you why, because a discussion which I was having with the presenters yesterday, a brief discussion, experience has shown that the earlier you get all these policies, these procedures, these systems, these laws in place following a disaster, the more sustainable it is through the emergency and relief phase, into early recovery and into medium and long-term recovery and reconstruction. If you miss out on that opportunity in the first few weeks of institutionalizing these and taking the right decisions and making the right choices, you miss the boat. And what happens is, during the relief and emergency phase, people are so busy, governments are so busy, other stakeholders, shareholders are so busy in a very fragmented manner in doing their own work. This includes relief organizations, civil society, NGOs, and apart from the state, and even apart from the people themselves, that you just do not have the opportunity, if you miss it that is, to then later on go back and try to bring everything into the fold of a common framework. And I think that is where most of the post-disaster efforts have really gone awry. So I think that's something that is an extremely important lesson that has been learned. Now, how can you make sure that when a disaster happens, the state and all of the shareholders and stakeholders, they have at their disposal a system where they can tap or benefit from these lessons? This requires an attitudinal change and a behavioral change, and that cannot happen as soon as a disaster happens. So although we can talk about disasters being looked at or adversity being looked at as an opportunity or window of opportunity to institutionalize some of these things, there's so much of an emergency and urgency, and time is definitely a luxury that it just does not happen. So what, from GFDR's perspective, what we haven't learned or what we should be learning is, we really feel that this is where this kind of learning from lessons needs to be institutionalized in advance of disasters. Unless that happens, I don't think so we can fully reap the benefits of all the lessons that we have of what to do and what not to do in a post-disaster situation. We can work with governments who are interested, and we already have examples of Indonesia, Philippines, Nepal. We have other interests coming in from Djibouti, even Central Asian states, and even from Africa, where we've seen so many disasters happen in the last year or year and a half, that countries are now saying that help us to prepare for these disasters in advance. Help us to think through what kind of policies, what kind of systems need to be put into place in advance so that they can be immediately activated as and when a disaster happens. And you'll be surprised that wherever I've been interacting with some of these counterparts, gender has figured prominently. So there is this recognition that gender and women empowerment does play a major role, because they've read about these lessons, but at the time when the disaster actually happens, because of other priorities, these lessons are either forgotten or they're put on the back burner. So I think this is the question that I would like to put to everyone. We have to make sure that government have the policies about cash transfers, governments have the policies about subsidies for housing. How can those policies be made or tailored for disaster situations so that they can be thought up, they can be conceived, they can be put into place in advance and then activated as and when a disaster happens? Thank you.
Thank you, Raja. I think you've given us some very encouraging examples of how the gender dimension can be built into the post-disaster response and make the outcome better for everyone. So I think there's indeed more to learn from disasters, and I think in particular the notion that also Marianne brought forward, that this is an opportunity to address issues of gender inequality that go beyond the immediate gender disaster response. Now, Marianne pointed out that one of the key issues for integrating gender into the disaster responses is the operational side, and we have an operational guru with us, George Soraya. Yes, it is you, George. who is the urban sector leader in the Jakarta office, but also been very, very heavily engaged in the post-disaster response in Jakarta and Aceh and elsewhere. So I wonder, George, whether you would want to just briefly reflect a little bit from your operational side, how you can integrate gender into the post-disaster response.
Thanks. I was just listening, also maybe now that reflecting after you explained about whether we're not learning. I'm not sure whether is not we're not learning, or actually our expectation has also increases every time. I was working about 15 years ago in one of the disaster recovery. The word gender was not even mentioned, maybe in that particular project. People was not even considering, but 17 years ago. And of course, then there was a study shows that, well, you cannot do this. It's just not sustainable. In fact, that project turned out to be, most of the houses were abandoned, built by the people and abandoned, and people moved somewhere else. Now I had the benefit of looking back at that place. Luckily, I was not a casting leader, but it was interesting to see. When Aceh happened, actually, everybody was beginning to discuss about gender, even at the blueprint of Aceh, up front. We were discussing and everybody said, yes, we understand it has to be women participation, it has to be involved, it's important for sustainability. Then quickly also we say, we have to work program for the widows in Aceh. So the first round, you have to actually identify those who are in need, mainly actually focus on the genders, women, and getting them participate into it. And anyway, I think there's nothing to do with the World Bank project, and we did the first round of house provision to the widows and to the women, vulnerables and so on. Now, looking back after 5 years, they're the most disadvantaged because they get the worst house. Because after a year, the unit prices increase in the process, and those who get the first one, actually the vulnerables, the poor and everything, actually get the worst house. Because good intention initially, they wanted to give the first priority, etc. But as time goes by, as the money flows in, all NGO give, and also other countries give much bigger unit prices, so they get beautiful houses, except those the first one. When you look back and say, well, we learned something on that one. But nevertheless, the discussion was there. When we started in Jogja, we said, well, it's not enough. I think we should have indicators that actually separate men and women, male and female satisfaction, and also the same separation and so on. But what I learned is eventually people can go as far as they understand and as far as they're aware. It's not a standard that we put in that will happen on the ground. It's the level of awareness. Yes, you can induce it, you can increase it, but the capacity of that place that actually will determine how far it goes. Now, I agree. Investing on facilitator will increase that capacity a lot. If you get the facilitators into that discussion and into this understanding, you will get a lot. But whether every community will reach to the same level, I don't think so. So it depends on how we want to see it. I always interested on the delta rather than the standard. Are we improving? Are we moving in the right direction? Rather than a standard that is worldwide established, I would prefer the standard would be the delta. Now, all these studies, I think, misses the delta between the previous one and the current one. And the standard has also improved. The standard has the delta. In fact, we actually improve our standard, increase our standard. Now, compared to this standard, always there is a lag. But when you look longitudinal, I think we have improved. Not as much as we want to, but it's improved. Now, I think the challenge in the future is to put a standard of a delta rather than a worldwide standard or even national standard. Can we increase as much as the capacity of the people can take it? I always believe this is an organic one. This is not a mechanic one that you can pull it, understand they will do it. It's almost like a tree. You cannot pull it every day to become tall. You can induce it, but the tree itself will decide how far it will go. And I think community is exactly like that. That's what my learning.
Thank you, Georgia. I think wise words to remind us that we have come a long way, and that what's happening today is certainly better than what was happening 20 years ago when the World Bank created its first Women in Development unit or team. Nonetheless, the challenges remain, and we have a long way to go still. Now, time is such that I can just give the floor for 2 questions or comments. So whoever is first. Yes, please,
Well,
Peter.
were there, like in Pakistan, there were legal obstacles. Were the same thing in Indonesia, and does it vary provincially or locally?
Legal obstacles to what?
I mean, some legal reforms were required to help facilitate the women's participation or rights. I don't know if that was true, I should know, but I can't remember if it was true in Indonesia, whether there was any of that. And another thing is that some of the CDD, the big PNPM projects, one of the things that I've read about is that a lot of the governance and participatory gains within the project don't translate, or there's not clear evidence that it translates into, local, outside of the project into the local, things once the project is over or into other sectors. So it's sort of like a sector thing. But I'm just wondering if, longitudinally, the gains that are made within the project end up continuing or building when the project closes down. We're just like, okay, we aren't required to have women in the meeting anymore. So we'll just do what we always did. We will be there, but all the men will do all the talking.
Okay, thank you. Let's just collect one more, if there is one more. Yes, please.
My question is a bit out of the gender, but it helps. I picked up one word you say when you get involved to do things, and it's part of healing. I like to hear on this post-disaster, how do you build in the trauma factor? Because women has a major role in helping all this, but how do you help them heal or tackle any of these things? Did we think of it? How do we go about it? Is it an aspect that has been thought through? I'm just curious.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Now, if you could reflect on those 2 questions. And anything that you have heard, both from Raja and Margaret, and sort of wrap it up within 5 minutes. However, as one person who still has the privilege of expressing some thoughts, Shamima, please.
I'll let Marianne, mine is more of a closing.
Okay, very well then.
No, legally you didn't have to change. It was the land rights where there was legal reforms. George is far more eloquent than I could ever be. The real issue around community development is large-scale projects, unlike George, do not recognise that communities are as individual as individuals, and that each community develops in different ways and has different drivers for participation. They have a one-size-fits-all, and unless you have some visionaries there, a bit like George, who are willing to be flexible around the edges, are willing to push how things are done and to be innovative, which is why I argue for being more flexible with funds to enable those innovators to flourish in difficult circumstances. We know what drives good participation, and all the good practice that we know comes from communities where those drivers already existed, because the opportunities to really engage either in different facilitation techniques or better analysis or different ways of working were very rarely there. And when they were, generally, you had to be quiet about it. You couldn't actually tell your boss in government that that's what you were doing, because you could lose your job. And I'm not joking here. In Indonesia, if you were seen to step outside of what you're supposed to do, you could lose your job or get moved to the Indonesian equivalent of Siberia. West Papua or Kalimantan or Aceh, but you were already there. Whoops. So that's the issue around community mobilisation, I think, and community development. And I think on psychosexual trauma support, that for me was very interesting because I am quite curious about things. And I was curious to see that within these gap-filling projects, there was never an element of psychosexual trauma support. It was always within education or health and some livelihood recovery, but never in housing. So the fact that something like Reconstruction contributed to the healing process, and this was things that women and men said, was the approach that they took, the very slow approach which put people back in control. Speaking as an ex-rape counsellor, which is where I started, it is the feeling of taking back control after trauma, which is one of the first steps towards re-establishing your identity and moving forward. And so Reconstruction was able to do that. How much more it could have done had it been given extra money and extra time to support, who knows? And maybe that's what we need to think for the next stage. We also need to think about the fact that men are affected by trauma as well, and one of the exhibitors of trauma for men is violence. What did we see in Aceh? Post-disaster, immediate post-disaster, 70% of women in IDP camps were reporting sexual harassment, sexual abuse or rape. That is morally unacceptable. Forget about economics, it's morally unacceptable. But to think that imprisonment is the only way to deal with it is not recognise how men deal with trauma. And having to invest in gendered terms in both men and women in psychosexual counselling.
I think this point that is so important that as we, 70% of all the damage and cost is always on the settlement. It looks to be very simple, but actually the cost is there. And sometimes if we don't get the participation in that 70%, actually you lose the biggest opportunity for recovery, psychological recovery is one of the biggest opportunities. And I realized this, I was following some of the families, how they change when the hope comes, when they start in control. And I think the approach of getting them participating actively in the reconstruction is a healing process on its own. That one, it's not healing process in abstract. It's a real things they do. And I think that's where we should look into, make it more effective on that.
Thank you, George. I have to say that this is also an argument that we've been using for a long time in the post-conflict transition. There's tons of efforts of reconciliation, but if they don't come with anything concrete to bring the communities together, they will not take them that far. So, yes. Shamima, last word to you.
Yeah, just my main comment was exactly along those lines, that a lot of our lessons, I'm managing post-disaster now. I used to manage post-conflict reconstruction before, and I find that there is so many similarities in terms of the approaches and their applicability to both post-conflict and to post-disaster reconstruction. And bridging those two, the lenses are different, but the approaches really do apply very well across. Aceh was very unique in that we were doing post-disaster reconstruction in a post-conflict context. So added to those complexities, but I really find this encouraging that we all can come together and look at how we transfer knowledge between the two. The other point I wanted to make was that when we started off with this working paper, my main thing to point to the team was that let's look not only at the impact of reconstruction on women, but the impact of women on reconstruction. Because so much of our lessons really comes from the fact that the voice and therefore the choice is so different when you've got women involved and when you don't. I think that's another perspective really to keep in mind as we're looking at how women's empowerment makes sense and makes a difference. So I want to also remind everybody that we do have publications here. We have a very nice book that tells us the story of Aceh. Please feel free to pick these up. These are for you. And if you would like to take a couple back for colleagues, please feel free to do that.
Thank you very much, Shamima. So for me, it comes just to conclude this 1.5 hours of, I think, a very interesting presentation, discussions, and short but nonetheless discussion as well among pertinent points. I think this was very enriching, and let's just please take all of this with us before the next disaster strikes. So thank you very much, Anita, Marianne, Margaret, and Raja, and wish you a good afternoon.